I want to talk about a little corner of storytelling today, and the changes therein, and how those changes are absolutely amazing for education. I've been doing all sorts of things in the digital storytelling world. These include writing and directing story worlds. I'll get to Bluebird in a minute. And doing online documentaries, helping other program makers and storytellers tell their stories in a digital context, and also sort of facilitating how we all reach stories in the digital realm. So stories are essentially a form of memory. They have this unspoken fundamental part in our lives because as social creatures, which is a bit rich coming from an introvert like me, but as social creatures, we have this drive to share our stories which are, as I say, essentially memories, our memories and experiences with other people. If we share those things, it basically fulfills fundamental drives in all of us. And here we are at TED, and TED is this incredible facility for sharing stories and ideas. And it's perfect for me because, sitting there trying to bring this story together, bring this speech together, and I thought, how am I going to do this? And how am I going to make this great? And let's just say I kept it concise by looking at other TED Talks. And one of the talks I came across, you may well have seen, which is by Sir Ken Robinson. Passive little title there. 40 million views, no big deal. But amazing. And I took 3 things away from that. And I thought, gosh, this is actually what my talk is about. My talk is going to be about answering the challenges of another talk. This is one that's 10 years old. And Ken's challenges are still very much with us. So he had 3 things that he said in particular that really, got me interested. One was that creativity is as important as literacy in education. He also said we tend to get educated out of creativity. And he said that ideas of value come about through an interaction between different disciplinary ways of seeing. And I love all those things, particularly that last one. He's really taken his gloves off for those first 2, but that last one is it's so important. And the collision of ideas is what really gives us creativity. So digital storytelling, digital narrative, which is, it's a fairly recent phenomenon, really. We're absolutely getting into it. But it answers those challenges just marvelously, and it does that because it can create environments for learning that are essentially creative, dynamic, social, like us, essentially. So I'm going to talk about 2 types of story today. And I'm not going to go backwards, I'm going to go forwards. 2 types of story today. But before we get there, I've got this metaphor. Let's call it a metaphor. It's a bit too woolly to call a theory. And it's in 2 parts, but I think it really explains why digital narrative is so important and not only that, but foundational to the thing that is story. And so we're going to talk about how foundational story is to us as human beings. But I think what I'm trying to say is that digital narrative is bringing something quite foundational and new to the form of story. Okay, so it's in 2 parts. It's got a little bit of philosophy of mind, and it's got a little bit of Oscar Wilde. And it starts with a question. And the question is, so, why are stories so foundational to the experience of being a human being? And my back-of-the-envelope theory on that is it's because our ability for self-reflection combines with an instinct to be social. And in doing that, it asks us to take the memories and experiences that we have and formulate them in entertaining and instructive ways to share with others. That's really all it is. But unpacking that is, that in itself is quite an amazing idea. I also want to read you a couple of academics on this subject as well, just to sort of give myself a bit of support in that. Let me just read to you. Roger Schank and the late Robert Abelson, who are brilliant psychologists, The reason that humans constantly relate stories to each other is that stories is all they have to relate. Put another way, when it comes to interaction in language, all our knowledge is contained in stories and the mechanisms to construct them and retrieve them. So stories are a form of memory, and we share those between ourselves, and we also format them. We format them into books, we format them into film, we format them into television, you name it. That idea of formatting is really, really interesting. Basically, we can now say, and I'm sure we all kind of knew this intuitively already, that stories are therefore a fundamental aspect of our lives. They're an absolutely foundational part of being a human being, and we share them all the time. Everything we're doing, we're sharing them all the time. So let's now retreat back to that bright digital corner that I wanted to talk about in terms of the storytelling universe, and ask another question. This time the question is, okay, so what if the format of that story could be more like us? Not static, but dynamic, social, adaptive. Wouldn't that be able to create a very impressive, very creative, very interesting environment for learning? Yes, it would. All right, so that's that bit. And then the second bit is Oscar Wilde. Who knows the story of the portrait of Dorian Gray? Yeah? A story for our times. I think so, anyway, really. All right, I'm going to give a little synopsis because it's great to be reminded of these things. So it really is a timeless story too, but I think you'll see why it's kind of appropriate to the now. Basically, a very fortunate young man, you might say beautiful young man, he's influenced to pursue a life of hedonism and high aesthetics. So basically, go out, party, have a good time, just think of yourself. And he's inspired to do this just as a portrait of him is being finished by a famous artist, and the portrait's going really, really well. And actually, it's interesting. The artist is like, no, I don't want anyone to influence this man. I'm capturing this purity of youth, basically. And then this hedonist comes in and blows it. This last conversation before the portrait's finished. So encapsulated into the portrait is this tainting, I suppose, of this character. And sure enough, the portrait gets finished. Dorian takes the portrait from the painter. He sort of obviously feels a bit weird about it because he puts it in the attic and goes about his business of living large. Now, what happens essentially is that as he lives large, he makes all sorts of moral decisions. Some of those decisions, or basically a lot of those decisions, are not so good. And the portrait in the attic, or in the room upstairs, begins to reflect those decisions. Whereas beautiful Dorian just stays beautiful, unscathed completely. So, spoiler alert, it ends badly. But anyway, we'll move away from Dorian now. The point is that let's just fixate on that narrative device, the magic portrait. Digital narrative can take a narrative device like that and just realize it in these extraordinary new ways, and that in itself is very exciting. So, a little bit further on. Now, okay, this is the last part of the metaphor, and this is audience participation bit, which is, again, really rich coming from someone who loathes audience participation. Although I loved the singing. Oh, that was fantastic. Actually, that's why I'm still here, basically. It gave me a lot of courage. Definitely. Okay, so it might help to close your eyes for a sentence. It's really not much, but this next sentence, I want you to bring to mind a photograph that you're really familiar with. Might be that it's been in your life for a long time. And now think about, maybe you've looked at that picture and you thought, something's different about it this time, something's changed. Well, obviously the picture hasn't changed, you've changed, your experiences, your memories in the world have changed. And so the picture begins to look a bit different. You might rationalize that, but now think about a book or a film that you love, that you've seen before, and then years later you come back and you see it again. And you're like, oh yeah, that was different. Well, obviously it was a static piece of storytelling and it's you that's changed. Well, what if the picture could change? What if through interaction with not just life and your experiences, but the picture itself, what if it could change? He's supposed to like not disappear in a blink. He's supposed to like fade out mysteriously. But you know what I'm saying? So yeah, a digital tool set makes possible a story that is basically adaptive, not static, potentially much more like memory, and therefore much more like us, which is a really interesting proposition for education. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some work. So digital has touched many, many areas of, let's call it more traditional storytelling. So books are no longer in print. Audio, like radio and television, have decoupled from appointment viewing, and we can sort of pretty much see them when we want to now and listen to them. I mean, it's been a complete revolution for what we used to call radio. It's extraordinary. Cinema is available for a much longer period of time now on so many devices. So digital, certainly in functional ways and to some extent aesthetic ways, has already touched storytelling in many, many ways. But the one, the types that I want to talk about are emerging, and especially this first one. So about 5.5 years ago, which is like 50 years in internet years, by the way. So maybe it's not that old, but and maybe not that young. But about 5.5 years ago, I worked on this brilliant project called Bluebird AR with a group of people at the ABC. And we were exploring new ways of telling drama, new ways of telling stories, for sure. But I think some of the aspirations we had don't match the aspirations we came out with. What we came out with was spectacular in terms of a series of lessons that can be applied to education, and which I'm very excited about. So Bluebird is absolutely an example of a story or a picture that when it's looked at, it's changed from being looked at. It absolutely took the audience and brought them to the center. It made them highly participatory. And basically, the story of Bluebird itself was a collision between the storytellers, us, and the audience. That was very, very interesting and very, very complicated. But the outcome of that was magnificent as a learning experience. So Bluebird played out online. When we say alternate reality, what we're talking about is kind of like a juxtaposition between reality and so what might happen in reality and what is happening in reality. So it's almost like a war of the worlds for our times, if you like. Of course, you can't do war of the worlds anymore because we've got multimedia. The idea of pulling the wool over our heads alienates us completely, so we didn't try for that. But what we do is we sacrifice the fourth wall by saying, oh, okay, I know this is an alternate reality, but I'm going to go headlong into it anyway. So people spent a long time working through the plot of Bluebird, breaking things open, moving that plot forward. And in the process, because it was about quite a complex subject, it was about geoengineering, they learned a lot of different multidisciplinary facts and brought those together into theories. And as they brought their theories and they raised their theories and socially people commented on those theories and they all sort of surfaced these ideas up. And the plot, as a result, moved forward. I'm just showing you sort of some slides of images here. So for instance, you can see here someone I'm just about to talk to. It's a Melbourne Year 11 high school student and his highly developed theory about the mesosphere. So when Bluebird was in full swing one day, we received an email from Ken Caldeira, who is a leading climate scientist from Carnegie Institute for Science. He was forwarding an email from Daniel Sullivan, a Year 11 student at the time at Melbourne High School. Daniel had written to him all by himself, having unlocked these amazing pictures from Bluebird. We can see here sort of flying saucer-like helium balloons that are going to float up into the stratosphere and release sulfates to try and test a cloud. He'd taken this, he'd slightly modified the imagery, and he'd sent it to Ken. only the leading climate scientist and expert on geoengineering, and said, "What do you think? Do you think this will fly?" And it's like, and Ken's writing back saying, "Now you've got me wondering whether Daniel's real." It was like this fantastic moment. It's a nice little 360. So anyway, I would just summarize the Bluebird time by saying that this dynamism, this sort of social curiosity, this push to the things that Sir Ken's talk were asking for, creative thinking, collision of interdisciplinary ideas. If you provide that state in a learning environment, it's very, very powerful, very powerful. It's like a pure drop. It's lovely. And it's lovely to watch as well. It's very exciting. So there's a flip side, of course, to this theory, which is factual storytelling, factual digital storytelling, where, of course, you're not really making an alternate reality as such. You're telling a story. But what we do there is, we've called this for a long time now, digital multimedia. Now, digital multimedia is just a fancy way of saying bringing all sorts of different types of media together to tell a story. But that in itself is a fantastic thing to do because you are giving basically a more 360-degree perspective on something. So I've been really fortunate to tell the story of Sydney Opera House on 2 occasions. And the thing about the Sydney Opera House is that the more you understand about the backstory of this incredible building, the more obviously it enhances your experience of the place if you go, or just the fact that it's this extraordinary World Heritage listed masterpiece. Also an incredibly special piece of land with a long story stretching back thousands of years. All of those aspects of the story give you this fantastic point of view. So that's what digital storytelling is doing in a factual way. It's giving you context in the broadest way possible. So I'll just play you a little animation. So I'm going to just take one little story, which is the idea behind the shells, actually. So why is Sydney Opera House so distinctive? Well, Sydney Opera House is so distinctive because of the shells. The shells are what people see all around the world. Next to Darth Vader, Sydney Opera House is one of the most recognizable images in the world. Fascinating. The submission drawings, the competition entry for the Sydney Opera House, look nothing like the shells that went up. I mean, of course, there was a similarity, and you can see the relationship. But 3 years later, engineers and architects still hadn't found the right solution. So it's this amazing story about how they got to it. And then, of course, it's the edge of the possible that they could even put it up. And in this one story, through interviews, through archival photographs, obviously through sort of standard storytelling of text, new animations that sort of explain these sort of very complex principles very, very quickly to you. In this sort of encompassed way, you get to learn the story. And so I'm talking about literally within 20 minutes, you can be an absolute expert about the spherical solution, which is great because that was something that took more than 3 years to get to. Right, so we get to the VR bit, the virtuality. What I'd like to say about that is, having said that digital narratives are, this fantastic new way of telling stories, but particularly learning in the realm of education, I also want to talk about this big jump that digital narrative is making this year into virtual reality. And it is early days for virtual reality. Even though the tech, to some extent, and certainly the ideas, have been around for decades. And in fact, stereoscopy is nothing new. We think the ancient Greeks knew what they were talking about when it came to stereoscopy, so there's that. But even if you look 22 years ago, here's like a cover I worked on when Photoshop was 4 years old. Virtual reality 22 years ago. But this year, with the fact that it's a consumer device, it's just an enormous moment in the digital revolution. And it's exactly why I decided to call my talk this, even though I've been talking about stories. So we may see it as a novelty now, but I think we'll look back and we'll see this sort of moment in terms of what the principles of virtual reality are. I think we'll see this moment as significant as when we first saw the Earth from space, which I believe was back in 1968. Thank you. That's my talk.